lineup, and I see folks are still trickling in, but you may already have noticed that Kyle Arbuckle is not hosting this week. This is his baby. So to honor Kyle, we're going to continue with one of his traditions, which is asking everyone on the call to put their name and where they're calling in from in the chat. So I see folks are still jumping on, but if we can start with that. Hi, Ashley from Georgia. Jennifer from Texas, Houston, Texas. Bridgett, a panelist from Oakland. Chantel from Alaska. JR, also a panelist from Chicago, Southside. Israel from Las Vegas, like Sydney. Let's see. Felicia from Alabama, welcome. Another Houstonian, Cynthia. Sarah Gallagher from Connecticut. Christina from Canton, Ohio. Gary from Boise, Idaho. Wow, a lot of folks are calling in from all over. Who else? Ananka from Chicago. Mary from Madison, Wisconsin. Eric from Richmond, Virginia, also panelist. Tonda from Bloomington, Indiana. Veda from Chicago. Sydney, clarifying, in DC, but from Las Vegas. Nitu, our colleague from Chicago. Aaron Anderson from Little Rock, Arkansas. Joanne from Austin, Texas. Emma, another colleague from Durham, North Carolina. Brooke Evans from Madison, Wisconsin. There's Kyle from Charlotte. Hi, Kyle. Susan from Springfield, Illinois. Carnetta from New York City. Miss Jumper from San Diego. Wendy from Tennessee. Rafiq from Cincinnati. Courtney from Lincoln. And yes, Nitu says so many Chicago housing comrades on this call, and Houstonians. That's where I'm from. We got Angela from Minneapolis. Awesome. Anyone else? If not, Juan Pablo from Dallas. Yes, Texans. A large showing. Great. Well, we'll keep reading them off as they come in, but we're gonna go ahead. Hi, Mike from Seattle. Oh, still some love for Kyle coming in. So yeah, we are taking over, myself and Sydney, now that Kyle is going to graduate school. So we thought we'd start by giving an introduction to ourselves and then going ahead and giving an introduction to the topic before we introduce our 4 different presenters today, and want to make sure we leave enough time for Q&A and discussion, because this is all about preparing and anticipating the end of the eviction moratorium and hearing experiences with rental assistance. So before we get started, my name is Olivia Arena. I am a housing advocacy organizer for NLIHC, and I have been here since October of last year. I came on board to support some of the COVID work and to cover for Joey Lindstrom while he's out on sabbatical. And I'll let Sydney introduce herself.
Hi everyone, my name is Sydney Betancourt. Like I stated earlier, I'm from Las Vegas, Nevada, and I recently moved to DC a year ago, and I just started in this position as a housing advocacy organizer about a month ago. So I am fairly new, but very excited to work with all of you.
Great, so just a few things about the call. All of our panelists will be on video and presenting various material. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, but share any resources. We'll be sharing links in the chat box. So feel free to chat on the side also. If you have any questions or comments, again, use the Q&A or raise your hand and we'll call on you in the Q&A. Hey, Rebecca from Chicago also. So we wanted to have this topic because, as many of you know and have been engaged with advocacy around, the federal eviction moratorium is slated to end, though it was extended for a month, at the end of July. So with a little over 2 weeks left, there is potentially, as we say, a tsunami of evictions coming. And even with support right now for folks to not be evicted for non-payment of rent, people are still falling months behind on rent and owing arrears. So we know that when we talk about the eviction moratorium, it goes hand in hand with talking about rental assistance, which we at NLIHC and many of you on the call helped advocate for and fight for the entirety of the pandemic. Now we were awarded billions of dollars, and it's time to make sure that that money is getting effectively out to folks like yourselves. So we thought it was really important to have this call to talk about the end of the eviction moratorium, to talk about advocacy strategies and organizing strategies that combat evictions, and then also to talk about rental assistance and potentially to hear about any challenges or opportunities that you've had with your rental assistance programs. So yeah, that's an overview of it. We'll be talking a lot about what we can do right now in light of the next 2 weeks. And we have 4 really incredible speakers that are going to talk about that. Willie J.R. Fleming from Chicago is from the Chicago Anti-Eviction Campaign. He'll be talking about anti-eviction organizing in Chicago. He's the executive director and has an incredible resume of community organizing and anti-eviction work. Following him, we have 2 attorneys from the National Housing Law Project, Bridgett Simmons and Eric Dunn, who are not strangers to Tenant Talk, and will be talking about your rights as renters and how to start preparing for the end of the moratorium and what those rights and advocacy strategies look like. And then finally, we have another new colleague, Sarah Gallagher, to talk about our Erase project, which is ending rental arrears to stop evictions. I hope I got that right. And talking about rental assistance programs and overview and what that means for you and your state. Then we'll open it up for everyone to start talking about their experiences and asking questions. And then we'll wrap up with some of the ways that you can immediately take action. So I'll end with some action items at the end of the call. But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Willie J.R. Fleming.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'll do a video shortly. First, I want to thank National Low Income Housing Coalition for having us on this call, and thank them for their efforts, not just locally with us, but nationally. I also give a big thank, and it's hard to do this. Now, I'm an activist and an advocate, but it's hard to do this. I want to give some credit to our federal legislators, state legislators, county and city legislators. I bear witness since the COVID epidemic that a lot of resources have come down through the federal level in terms of rental assistance. And most recently, our state passed statewide legislation and local legislation that have supported eviction diversion, increased rental assistance for landlords and tenants. But most importantly, they streamlined a process to get the money out the door into the people's hand. I think most notably our Cook County government program was just featured in the Washington Post along with National Low Income Housing Coalition for some work. Our state continues to take measures and look at ways they can improve upon what we're doing locally. One of the things we've encouraged them is to work not just from a state level, but have more interagency communication between not just legislators, but agencies, government like the Illinois Housing Development Authority, where a lot of these funds come through, our Cook County Housing Authority, our Cook County body of government that deals with housing, our Cook County Land Bank, our City of Chicago, who all have created unique homeowner and tenant assistance programs that have helped to get the money out the door. There's a lot of other things we feel that could be done. Given the eviction moratorium is about to expire, and as we await more money through the American Rescue Plan, we want to see some efforts streamlined by local government. One of the things I also wanted to talk about was the court support. Want to applaud some of the local efforts by Cook County government in terms of the judicial system. and the resources they're providing tenants, homeowners with eviction diversion programs. I think nationally it was a mandate, and a lot of local jurisdictions are starting to take heed to that. We believe that they can improve upon these programs to ensure that evictions are reduced tremendously. But we do want to acknowledge that efforts are underway and have been underway within our Cook County government to ensure that folks are getting every opportunity to stay in their home. And that's also with the sheriff department. Community-wise, we want to make sure organizations like myself and others, as we've been doing since the beginning of this year, when we were looking at the expiration of the moratorium, are having intentional conversation with other community groups. Some of the steps that we take at the Chicago Anti-Eviction Campaign is to begin to expand our collaboration with other community groups in different parts, the north side, west side, and south side of Chicago. Groups who traditionally do not work in the housing and eviction area are now adding spaces so that residents of their community, regardless of the issue area they're working on, who are facing eviction, have access to the right resources. So we've been working on what we call anti-eviction resource centers, right, or housing resource centers, and spaces where they can find legal assistance via community, university, and legal clinic partnerships, where they can come and get that type of assistance. The city and county is allowing for some setups on some levels of the court building for legal clinics to provide eviction diversion work. But we believe that more community groups have to step up, collaborate with others, and provide space that because this crisis is going to happen. I have a little kitten that just refuses. It's going to run across the keyboard. I'm afraid it does it, just what this kitten does in the call. So, lost my train of thought. So we have certain systems and measures set in place due to various federal legislation and allocations. We're looking to expand, like we said, community groups participation who traditionally don't work in housing. If it's folks who working in the education field, we know that, well, worrying about a child education is just as important as worrying about where they're getting that education from and what home they're coming from. And we know that with expiration of the moratorium, that we're going to see far more marginalized people, particularly people in Black and brown communities, and being impacted by this, not just from the standpoint of evictions due to non-payment of rent, but evictions because some landlords are going to get foreclosed on, right? And so we talk about providing eviction resources and legal clinic assistance, not just for tenants, but for landlords, so that we don't lose tenants and landlords at the same time, and also future housing providers. One of the strengths we have at the Anti-Eviction Campaign, thank goodness, is that we're community partners with National Community Stabilization Trust, Fannie Mae, and Freddie Mac. And we've been able to utilize a lot of our inventory for transitional housing, along with our partners and other community buyers through this program known as the Neighborhood Stabilization Initiative and Fannie Mae Community First Program, which allows for community organizations to get foreclosed property at a discount, not tremendous, but good enough where we're able to find housing alternatives for those, be it transitional housing, homeless housing, low-income housing, rental or low-income home ownership program. So we were being able to be creative in providing some assistance as a housing provider, not just an advocacy group, through the efforts of Fannie Mae, as I say, Freddie Mac, NCST, FHFA, and National Low Income Housing Coalition, who provided some support a year ago for us, and who's also providing not just support this year, but nationally in advocating for assistance for small landlords. I think that is one of the biggest pieces post-eviction moratorium that we're going to look at is these small landlords, small community development groups, small housing providers who provide housing for domestic violence victims, transitional housing, to make sure resources are in place. And so we've been advocating locally city, county, state, federal level to make sure we don't lose through this crisis necessary programming like domestic violence shelters. We don't lose rapid rehousing stock or lose organization providing rapid rehousing or continuum of care work, right? So we're working locally to integrate a lot of these programs from a federal, city, county, and state level, both government and nonprofit. And I think the strength of this is a lot of the collaboration that we already had existing since February between some university partners, legal clinics, and local government. To have these conversations taking place months ago made it possible to streamline a lot of programs and resources to tenants. So I always want to give acknowledgement to that. We do wish that there were more participation from local foundations, right? That could not just financially support organizations doing this work, but that could encourage their already grantees, some space to do some eviction assistance work and eviction prevention work. I have one more piece I want to go over. Let me pull that up. All right. Now, locally, I wanted to discuss what folks can do nationally, just like us. In the city of Chicago, we have a receivership program. We have a program that look to do blight reduction. In our county, on a county level, we have a land bank. In places where you have port authorities, land banks, or efforts underway for blight reduction, I think it's key for nonprofit organizations, housing providers, and government to put together a collective conversation. This is something that was discussed during the White House Eviction Prevention Summit. So I would only encourage that to everybody on this call to find ways to collaborate, expand, get out of that place of comfortability, and look to see how we can provide resource, not just as a government, a foundation, or an advocate, but across the board, how we can collaborate. I always say, seize the moment. Now's the time, and for the power of collective action. Thank you for this opportunity.
That's awesome. We've had some questions come in, and I wonder if we should hold those till everyone is done or ask them now. Chris O'Hara was asking about if there should be more eviction diversion done nationally. Some areas such as Minnesota are looking for a full year where people had to move due to non-payment of rent. It would be sealed and not shared publicly, and other places have a right to counsel, such as Philadelphia. And I know that's something that we've been pushing for in our House campaign is a national right to counsel. And I wonder if the National Housing Law Project folks would also be able to speak to that. JR, did you have anything you wanted to add about a national eviction or what you're seeing that might be best practice in other places outside of Chicago? I think you're muted. Oh, there you go.
Yes, I will always tell people to look at the National Low Income Housing Coalition House campaign. I would tell them to look at Matt Desmond Eviction Lab. A lot of these places have already on their website some of the best practices models. And you can actually take that and make it an organizing and advocacy tool to push local legislators to produce the same thing like right to counsel or eviction diversion program. So that's the power of collaboration.
Awesome. And Eric will also be talking about that a little bit. I'll put a link to the House campaign and talk about some ways that you can all take action. But without further ado, I'll turn it over to National Housing Law Project, Bridgett and Eric.
Thanks for having us. So there's a number of things that state and local governments can be doing to try and mitigate or prevent the oncoming tsunami of evictions. A couple ideas that we've been advocating for really throughout the pandemic. One, we call it non-evictable debt, but basically it's the idea that if somebody's able to pay their current rent, it doesn't really do the landlord any good to evict that person and bring in a new tenant, because the new tenant wouldn't be paying the arrearage from the original tenant anyway. So from a public policy standpoint, it doesn't really make any sense to allow those evictions. So one thing that could really help would just be to prohibit landlords from evicting people as long as they're paying their current and ongoing rent. Basically, no evictions just for the arrearage. People can apply for rental assistance, they can do payment plans. There's other things that can be done to deal with the arrearages, but people shouldn't be getting evicted for that. So that's one easy step that could put a big dent in the problem right away. Second, there's the eviction protections that have been in place were far from foolproof, are far from foolproof. They're still in effect. So a lot of people have already been evicted, have already been displaced. They may have moved to avoid acquiring an eviction record or something like that. Or they may have remained in their housing with the protection of an eviction restriction, even though they can't necessarily pay the rent because they can't get in somewhere else. So one thing that would really be helpful for state and local governments to do would be to enact some tenant screening protections so that people aren't denied housing just because they had an eviction case filed against them during the pandemic, because they fell behind in rent during the pandemic, because they still owe an arrearage to a former landlord who may have arisen because they lost their job during the pandemic. Again, common sense measures that will enable people to, even if they can't keep the housing that they're in, at least to avoid winding up homeless. Of course, state and local governments can still have their own moratoria in effect, and if they don't have a good system to distribute rental assistance in place, it's backed up, that's a good reason to continue doing that. At the very least, some states have begun putting in place what they call off-ramps to moratoria. So it's not a full moratorium, but Minnesota, for instance, requires a minimum of 15 days notice before you can go and evict somebody now. Which again, it's kind of a simple thing, but it effectively gives people 15 more days, and people have more of an opportunity to plan and prepare for what they're going to do next. Of course, as Mr. Fleming mentioned, there's been a push from the administration in DC to promote eviction diversion programs. And as I see it, these are programs where at the core, you're going to have at least an opportunity for the tenant and the landlord to have some kind of supervised negotiation with a third-party mediator, try to work out some way to preserve the tenancy, make sure that both parties are aware of the rental assistance available and how to apply for it, and that can potentially enable some people to preserve their tenancies. But with eviction diversion, it's really important to get the details right. One of the real impetuses for eviction diversion, it's coming from the courts because they've acquired these huge case backlogs. And if they can send people to these diversion programs, then it moves cases off the court's docket and gets them resolved versus the backlog. So from the standpoint of the courts, a lot of times the mediation programs, the diversion programs are successful if they result in a settlement, but they're less concerned about what the terms of that settlement are. So if somebody settles their case, but they're not keeping their housing, or they're not, coming up with a functional plan where they transition to some other housing and wind up homeless, the court looks at that as a success because they've resolved the case without using the court resources, but that's not really a success because, the person's not going to have housing. So making sure that these programs are focused on preserving housing, not just reaching settlements regardless of the terms. And in order for that to be realistic, people need to have legal representation in these mediations. If you don't have representation, it's hard to even really understand where you stand or to recognize if you have defenses. You may not really know what a good deal is, whether to accept an offer or make a counteroffer. So people need legal representation that really take full advantage of those programs. Last, for people that are not able to access rental assistance funds for whatever reason, they don't qualify, they're not able to get the funds for some reason, or if they need something short-term until the money is available. The payment plans, I put together a short list of some sort of terms to look for that are good, terms that are bad in negotiating payment plans. And just some general ideas that may not be applicable to every situation. Of course, with payment plans, it's what you can get. It's not, if the landlord has a really strong case and you've got a hostile court, you may not have a whole lot of bargaining leverage. But ideally what you want to do is get a payment plan on the arrearage and have a new tenancy, so that if you, for some reason, can't make the payments on the payment plan, that doesn't wind up being a lease violation that gets you evicted. So the payment plan can be something separate from the tenancy. You wouldn't want the failure to make a payment on the arrearage to be treated as a default on the current lease. You definitely want landlords to agree to cooperate if the tenant is attempting to get rental assistance funding to pay off an arrearage. You don't want tenants waiving their right to get those funds to help them out. So that doc is going to be available on my personal Google Drive. So you should have the link provided to you, and I'll try to have it up on NHLP's website as soon as possible. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Bridgett. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me once again, having both Eric and me this week. So today I will focus primarily on residents who live in HUD-assisted housing. What are things you can do or think about when trying to address your rental arrears after the eviction moratorium? So as Eric shared, repayment plans are a possibility both in private housing as well as subsidized housing. In the subsidized housing portfolio, HUD doesn't mandate that housing providers enter into a repayment plan with residents, but they very much strongly encourage it. And so it's transitioning from repayment plans to looking at your rent. So the first thing that we've been trying to encourage advocates as well as share with residents throughout the pandemic is that residents who live in HUD-assisted housing have an opportunity to request what is called an interim recertification. So what is that? That means if between your annual recertification, something happens that would change your portion of the rent, for example, a decrease in income, or you become now eligible for another deduction, you can go into either the housing provider in the multifamily portfolio or to the PHA in the public housing and voucher programs and request an interim recertification. And so what the interim recertification does, it decreases the resident's portion of their rent, which can be really helpful if, for example, during the pandemic, the family experienced a decrease in income. So I mention it now because in the multifamily program, if you request an interim recertification now, they will make that decrease in your portion of the rent. It becomes effective the month following the decrease in your change or the decrease in your income. So for example, say a family experienced a decrease of income in October of last year, but are just now requesting the interim recertification. The HUD's guidance in the multifamily program states that the owner should make that decrease in tenant portion of the rent effective back to November. I had to figure out what month came after October. So HUD's guidance in the multifamily program says that the owner should make that decrease effective in November, which is the month following the decrease in income. So in the public housing and the voucher program, HUD encourages housing providers to, or specifically the PHA to follow that same guidance, to backdate, make retroactive the effective date of a decrease in the tenant portion of the rent. Unfortunately, HUD has not mandated that PHAs backdate the decrease, but you may live in a jurisdiction where the PHA is willing to do that or has done that. So in addition to thinking about interim recertifications, also thinking about if your portion, if, for example, you meet a hardship exemption. So in the public housing, multifamily, as well as the voucher program, there's a thing called minimum rent. And essentially, families pay minimum rent when their they pay minimum rent when their portion would be lower than the minimum rent. So for example, if a family goes through annual recertification and it is determined that their portion would be less than the PHA's minimum rent, the PHA would then require the family to pay the minimum rent rather than what was calculated. So it's important to know that, specifically because if a family meets certain expectations, they can get a hardship exemption, which means that they wouldn't have to pay the minimum rent, right? So the minimum rent says you have to pay at least this amount. But if a family meets certain exemptions, for example, if they suffered a death in the family, if there was a loss of benefits, there are some other exemptions, the family could then qualify to not have to pay the minimum rent. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up my portion. I would just say, in terms of what can folks do in addition to some of the things that Mr. Fleming as well as Eric shared, is that you all are really important to your neighbors in building community power, right? So sharing information and community resources is really, really important. Also connecting with any community resources. So that includes legal aid organizations, having legal aid attorneys come out and do like know your rights trainings, or if folks are not comfortable with that, like doing it via Zoom. Also organizing your neighbors to share your stories with federal, state, and local elected officials. As mentioned before, it has really been the advocacy of residents throughout the country that have been able to get some really important protections in place and have been able to shed light on what is really at stake. So I really would encourage you to not only share your story, but encourage and engage your neighbors to share their stories with other elected officials.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for sharing some of that. And we'll have, if you have any links that would be helpful, go ahead and drop them into the chat. And if you also have any examples of jurisdictions that are doing really important, we have some at NLIHC work around solidifying renter protections at the local and state level. I know Oregon just passed an off-ramp to the eviction moratorium, and Washington State also enacted renter protections in the state legislature this year. Also feel free to post those in the chat. So we've been talking a lot about eviction diversion, and actually on our national call, Emily Benfer talked about effective eviction diversion. So you can check on our website for the posted recording and slides. Oh, we can also send them out in the Tenant Talk wrap up. But I'm going to switch to talk a little bit about rental assistance programs, which we've heard about. But I'm going to have Sarah Gallagher talk about what the emergency rental assistance covers and what NLIHC is doing to make sure to advocate on renters' behalf so that they receive that rental assistance funding. And then we're going to open it up to hear about experiences, asking question and answer, just to get a better sense of what it actually looks like on the ground, these different programs and measures. So Sarah, I'll go ahead and pass to you.
Great, thanks Olivia. And I'm gonna try to share my screen. So folks be patient with me because I always seem to be slow with this. All right, great. Let me know if you can see that. Awesome, thanks Olivia. Great, hi everybody, I am Sarah Gallagher. I am the Senior Director of our race project here at NLIHC, and so it's super exciting to be here with you guys. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about what the Emergency Rental Assistance Program is, how to get information about it, how to access it, and then we'll open it up, like Olivia said, to conversation around how it's working, what your experience is, and how you guys can get involved. So ERA, as you may hopefully are aware, I'd love to know what folks know about it after we stop talking, is $46 billion that was approved by Congress that's rolling down into states and localities to provide financial assistance and housing stability supports to prevent evictions. So we heard a lot about moratorium, the federal moratorium, that some states have local moratoria. And then, so this funding is meant to really prevent evictions and housing loss, for folks who may have arrears or might need support with forward rent to ensure housing stability. Like I said before, the money is rolling down to states, and then there's also some funding that's rolling down to counties or cities in different jurisdictions. So there might be different ways to access the funding in a state. It could be through a city, or it could be through a state, or it could be they might have combined programs, so it could be a combination of the two. The funding is designated or designed for households that are renter households, so having a lease or paying rent on a residential dwelling, so for rental households, and for households that have had financial hardship due to COVID directly or indirectly. And there's a couple buckets of money. So the first bucket had it directly related to COVID-19. And the second bucket of money is that financial hardship really is just during the time period of COVID-19. So that's a distinction to keep in mind as you're moving forward, because it might be just that something happened, you had a financial loss during COVID, and that made it so that you couldn't pay rent, or a friend of yours couldn't pay rent, or someone during that period, and so there's arrears during that time, and that would be eligible. The other thing is that there's risk of housing instability or homelessness. And the last is that household incomes are below 80% of the area median income, which could vary from place to place. So that's something that we'll have to look up in a community. The funding itself covers a wide range of activities and financial assistance. So rent, it covers rent, both back rent as well as some future rent if that's needed. So that could be arrears, but also sort of rent to move into a new apartment if a move is needed. It could cover utilities, again, both back and forward utilities, electricity, gas, oil, trash removal. In some cases, it'll cover late fees. In some cases, it can cover internet service. And then it also can cover moving expenses such as security deposit, application fees, screening fees. It could fund hotel motel costs if someone has to move and they have to get a hotel for a few nights or motel for a few nights. It can cover that kind of cost as well. The other thing that is allowed, but also varies by program, is that there is funding for housing counseling, for outreach, for case management, possibly legal representation or other housing stability services, but that's really very unique to different programs. So it's hard to say what they all have, but different programs may offer different things. And I'll also say that while all of this is covered, again, there's each program may implement a little bit differently. So you'll find that not all of this may be available at each location, but they may be administered differently. So it wouldn't be surprising if a program went in and said, no, we're not covering that, or we're only covering that if you have a lease or if you do X, Y, Z. So there might be some local variation. But in general, everybody should know that these are allowable by the feds, and that's a part where when we're talking about what we can do in advocacy, really we're trying to have as much flexibility, advocate for as much flexibility, as easy to get the assistance as possible, and to cover as much of the costs as needed. So some stuff to keep in mind is you should to know what is allowable. So one of the biggest things one of the things that we're advocating for at the coalition is really to make sure the application process is as simple as possible. We found that the Treasury, who is administering the money to state and localities, has given guidance on what is needed for documentation, how to define those eligibility criteria I mentioned before around hardship or loss of income. And so we're really trying to advocate to have the applications be as streamlined as possible, and as easy to access as possible, and as little documentation as possible. Each of the programs are really figuring out what that documentation standard looks like on its own, based on their own comfort level and based on the guidance. But some stuff you should know as when you're talking to programs and as you're talking to folks is that in general, there are some things that are allowed that not every program is doing and that we would love to encourage programs to do. So for instance, there is something called categorical eligibility for income, where a program could look at a neighborhood that is designated a low-income neighborhood based on census data, and they could say that people from that neighborhood are eligible for ERA and create a standard and documentation around that, so it doesn't become every individual having to define that they come up with neighborhood qualifications. Other thing to note is that, self-verification is allowable in ERA programs. So while many programs want income statements or leases or proof that you lost a job because of COVID, something related to COVID, the Treasury is allowing for people to say that, no, I'm attesting, I verify that this happened to me. Yes, I don't have proof of income right now because my income, I didn't have that, but I am saying, and I, under oath, or I know this is true, and I'm verifying that. So that is allowable. Not all programs are doing that the same or allowing that right now. They will be encouraged to more as it goes forward, but those are allowed for all 4 categories of eligibility. The third thing that is allowable and is not universally provided is directed tenant assistance. You'll find that some programs are requiring the landlords to participate in the program. Folks should know the Treasury does not require that. That the Treasury does say that the programs can provide assistance directly to tenants, and the tenants can then use that money to pay their rent, their back rent or their forward rent, and that does not have to go through the landlord. Again, that's something that we're advocating for here at NLIHC, and something that we would love programs to advocate for. And then I think Bridgett talked about this, and I was going to talk a little bit about it, but I won't. But that people living in federally subsidized housing are eligible for ERA. That includes people in buildings as well as people in using tenant-based vouchers. So how do you access ERA? So there's several resources out there. The Treasury has an ERA database, but we also here at the Coalition have developed a database of the different programs so that you can search. And so let's see if this works. No, it didn't work. Oh, there it is. There we go. So if you go to our ERA Resource Center, and I'll put the link in the chat, you can go to our state and local rental assistance dashboard, and you'll see here we are tracking all of the ERA, most of the ERA programs that are up and running. And what you can do is go here and you can search by state. I think, let's see, there's lots of folks from Chicago here, right? So we can go to Illinois, and we could see here all of the different programs are available in Illinois, and we can actually click on Cook County, and that will bring us to the Cook County Rental Assistance Program. So it's a really cool resource so that you can go in and you can check what, where I live and what programs are available, and you can call them all or, apply to them all as need be, or share them with friends as need be. So I think it's a really great resource, and that is a live resource that our research team is in there every day updating and putting new programs in. So that's available. So I'll talk a little bit about our call to action is the race ending rental arrears to stop evictions. And as we're gearing towards the end of the federal moratorium, we're really asking advocacy and local partners and tenant groups to focus on 3 key areas for the programs. We want to make sure that they're visible, that they're conducting equitable outreach and marketing, that people know about the programs and we're getting the word out about them and people know how to access them. We want to make sure too that the applications are accessible, they're streamlined, they're low documentation and low barrier. And then the third is we want to make sure that they're connected with eviction prevention and diversion. So they're really, working with courts, state and local courts, they're creating that intersection, they're referring, if there's a mechanism in place, if someone has an eviction filing, that they're given information about the ERA program so they can apply and understand how to get assistance, and that's really connected. So that is our call to action. We have an RFP that was released, and we're looking for proposals to help support that work on a local level, and I'll put the link to the RFP in the chat after I finish talking. So that is our call to action. Yeah, so the why we're doing the call to action is really to provide this framework to have this momentum, to prepare for the end of the moratorium, to really create resources and learn from tenants, from state partners, from landlords, what's needed to make these program works, and then to create forums where people are learning from each other and sharing information that'll lead to concrete action items. And then ultimately to build the foundation for long-term housing stability goals and to create the structure so that we're prepared for either another disaster or prepared moving forward to really to deal with the eviction crisis moving forward. So yeah, I'm sorry I rushed through it. I was just trying to look at time and leave some time for questions. So sorry for talking fast. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I will stop sharing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. Actually, a lot of questions came in and some comments. So I'll start with some of the comments that we saw on here. I think there's a discussion that was happening a little bit earlier about differences in eviction processes, how ultimately rental assistance needs to help tenants that then can pay their landlords. So that, that was kind of what you were talking about the importance of direct to tenant payments, so that if a landlord opts out, the tenant can still receive rental assistance. Tonda talked about how landlords are also included in the receipt of free legal advice, mediation, and other financial information in hopes that being more informed results in better outcomes for all. They've also seen an increase in smaller landlords concerned about neighbor and community safety due to emergency situations with unknown and unauthorized tenants. Bridgett provided the great resource of 211, which will provide resources in your community, which you can also use in addition to our database. I included a link to Treasury guidance where you can click on that and just look at the allocations by state. So Angela, you can look up Minnesota. You can also Google Minnesota rental assistance to see what specific agency is allocating it. Also should probably be in our database. Linda, I think this is a conversation for another day about the HIPAA violations and privacy with landlords in court disclosing information about tenants that potentially could identify them to their neighbors. So I think that's an important conversation. We've also heard about the benefit of having court data, that it helps advocates, direct service providers, case manage, as well as identify trends. But that is a very important balance and potentially another Tenant Talk conversation. So a question from Angela: how do you prove that you have lost a job due to COVID? Employers aren't giving out notices because this approves unemployment insurance for the employee. So how can people get one? In the same question is, why even ask for a COVID hardship form when the whole world has been affected by COVID? And I think this speaks to, and Sarah, you can talk to this, just about the need to streamline information and best practice.
Yeah, I think it's super good points. I couldn't agree more with both of them. I think it's so important to know with ERA 2, which is I don't think any communities are actually, I know some of our research team are on the phone so they could pop in the chat if I'm wrong here, correct me, are actually implementing ERA 2 now. But that changes the hardship to a time frame. Anything during the COVID emergency period. So that takes out the need to have to prove hardship due to, because that language was super confusing to administrators and everybody around. What does that mean? Because everyone's been impacted by it. So it really is, that's where the self-attestation becomes important, because you're right, you know, that getting a letter to say you were laid off because of COVID or is hard to get, especially if that change happened in the past, you know, happened 4 months ago or 6 months ago or 8 months ago, and you don't have that relationship with that employer anymore. So that's where the self-attestation comes in, and how in the different forms that programs are using to verify that was because of COVID. On our resource page, I won't link to it now, there are samples of different forms programs are using for the different hard eligibility criteria. So definitely take a look on there, and it'll show you sort of what they're asking for. But I think the guidance streamlines that COVID hardship in a positive way for the funding that's coming out now, which is good.
So as far as another question, and this is for everyone on the panel, Brooke had asked about a letter from Gene Sperling, DOJ, and agencies guaranteeing a prospective tenant's eligibility for ERA funds to help them secure a lease for those without a lease, or for those that have to move. I believe that you don't have to have a lease for some of the programs to receive ERA money, and it can be used for homeless diversion. But correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah. It can be used to cover moving expenses, and prospective rent.
Right, so it could be moving expensive, it could be prospective rent. I think this is again an area where local programs are making like local documentation decisions around, do you need a lease? Will you take self-attestation for my future living arrangement as a requirement? So there's a lot of local flexibility on that. You know, some programs are doing monthly, you know, giving a month at a time and wanting recertification. Some are doing, you can do 3 months at a time and allow for that. So there is some local tailoring to that.
And this is a question that I think wraps up kind of what everyone's been talking about. Looking into the next weeks, how would you sum up what tenants owing rent need to know? What are the main ideas that each of you are trying to communicate?
So I would say, in terms of what should folks know, you should know, one, what are your rights? So whether you live in subsidized housing or private market housing, what are the rights that protect you that are in place, you know, by the federal government or by state and local government? Two is to learn what resources are available locally, right? So ERAP money is really, really important in helping to address hopefully all of the rental arrears, but we know in most jurisdictions it's a portion of rental arrears. And then also, then the third piece is knowing if there is an opportunity to create with a repayment plan, as Eric described earlier. So those would be my top three.
Okay, I would just add, echoing what she said, get to know your housing advocates and organization working around it. Talk with any community organization in the area that might be in your area, whether it's healthcare, housing, clinics, elected officials, and find, like she said, resources out there. Also look for free legal clinic. There are a lot of legal clinic, both in the community, nonprofit sector, and also the university, right? Get acclimated to the courthouses where these processes are happening at, right? And you'll also find within most of the courthouses, there's an abundance of resources as well. And more than anything, please know the eviction process and timeline. There's nothing far worse than having to scramble last minute, removing your items from somewhere. And so we action a lot of folks, let's become actionary versus reactionary. So take proactive steps now. And in some cases, if you think it's a lose-lose situation in foreclosed homes as a tenant or anything like that, start to save up and prepare for making that move.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything. I think Bridget and Willie, you summed it up really well. Like knowing your rights, accessing the resources, knowing how to do that. And I guess the only thing is sort of getting to know your public officials and telling them how it's going. I think hearing from people who are trying to access the programs and utilize the programs around what's working and what's not is really important. So telling your stories and getting the word out on what needs to be improved to make sure that the funds continue to be accessible to everybody that needs them. I think we thought this was going to be a short-term game, but this is going to be a long game. So making sure that we're hearing what's working and what's not to improve it.
So I think that answers several questions. Just to lift up Lydia's comment as a tenant and as a tenant advocate, her concern with two things, or their concern with two things: the lack of outreach to tenants about resources available and the roadblocks local agencies can erect as barriers to receiving and distributing funds. And that's what we're really emphasizing, is the importance of self-attestation and limiting documentation needed. Carrie Hill, if you haven't applied yet, do it now. There's a huge backlog in most places, and it will take a while to process your application. And this is, so get in touch with legal aid for folks in Texas, which is several folks on the call. Jennifer has posted information about Lone Star Legal Aid. And then this is, my pivot question. So how can we force agencies to help? Because they look for many ways to deny people. And I think this is talking about local, state, and federal advocacy. So if anyone has anything to add on that, otherwise I'm going to talk about some of the federal actions that we're encouraging folks to take at NLIHC, including a call-in day. But Bridget, Willie?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I don't know how that slipped my mind. Outside of like the emergency rental assistance that came down from HUD, Treasury, every which way the money came. I think folks, again, as we talk about collective effort, I hear in one part, how do we get the information to the folks, right? And I know we're working across the country with groups, one group in particularly Alabama, Arch, as they work around emergency solutions, rapid rehousing, continuum of care. I will repeat this: continuum of care providers, rapid rehousing, emergency solutions grant folks, right? And public housing authority should be an immediate go-to spot, right? There should be streamlining the information from these entities, and I know they're doing it in Alabama, but that's correct. The problem outside of what happens post-eviction is how quick can we rapidly rehouse them. So giving all these conversations into one conversation or into one resource center is going to be key. And to Sarah's point, you got to push your legislators about what is working and what is not working. And we know one of the things that is not working is that this information, these resources and programs are not really hitting a lot of people that it's intended for. And thus is why we say the collaboration of organizations.
Absolutely. So if you all have just a few more minutes, we really want to get your feedback and also share out some action steps. So Sydney, my colleague, is going to put up some polls that we think will take just a minute or two. And then right at 7 p.m., I will post some links in the chat about action items to take, including a call-in day this Thursday, the 15th, to talk about the importance of housing as infrastructure and including housing provisions in an infrastructure package. So we have a few quick questions. up on the screen, and I'll mute myself while y'all go ahead and answer those and post some links in the chat.
In addition to, I'm going to be posting a Survey Monkey in the chat as well, and I'll be following up in that follow-up email with that link too. It's more of like a general survey for you all so that you can kind of give us feedback on what you would like to see from Tenant Talk Lives. That way we can continue the awesome work that Kyle has kind of set up for us, and I want to make sure that we're doing y'all justice. So I'll be putting that in the chat shortly.
Yes, so Linda, this is a plug for you. Any topics that you wanted to talk about, any questions that you have, we would like to hear. We would love to hear your feedback, and we're gonna, put out a short survey. And you can talk about how much you miss Kyle. Also, in that there's some free response questions. As far as some actions that you can immediately take, we have a Dear Colleague letter that's been circulating. We have representatives and senators that have signed on. It has our top 3 priorities that we would like to see in an infrastructure package. So we are encouraging individuals like y'all to call your member of Congress and ask them to sign on the Dear Colleague letter. And I'm including a link to some of that language in the chat because it's really important that we emphasize some of our priorities. So this is language for the Dear Colleague letter. And that emphasizes again the importance of highlighting housing in an infrastructure package. You can also add your organization to a sign-on letter urging Congress to again include our housing priorities, the House priorities in legislation to enact long-term change. So that's at the organization level. You can sign your organization on. You can also still call your member of Congress. If you're going to call your member of Congress, we are encouraging you to do it on July 15th, this Thursday, to emphasize that housing is infrastructure. So you will see that all over our social media, emphasizing our priorities as we go into a budget process. And so those are the 3 big things that we wanted to emphasize: to call your member of Congress and ask them to sign on to our Dear Colleague letter. I just dropped that link in the chat. If you're part of an organization, sign your organization on to the to our housed letter. Over 1,000 organizations have already signed on, so make sure yours is one of them. And then the last piece is to look out for more information about our National Call-In Day. Should be receiving an email. And again, that's to emphasize that housing is infrastructure and it can't be left out of a deal when we have so much momentum and that there's an incredible amount of need, as we've heard on this call. So thank you to everyone. Kyle, you're getting a lot of love in the chat. And Brooke says, thank you for being an anchor during the pandemic, Kyle. So that's some positivity on a Monday night. If anyone has any questions, one thing is to send us your experiences, to reach out to Sarah. Sarah can put her email in the chat. We want to hear from you. Also, feel free to use the Tenant Talk Facebook group to share experiences, ask questions, and to share resources. If anyone else, we can get a copy. We were taking notes. I have a link to the Facebook group, so I'll answer some of these questions before we sign out. But yes, any other questions? Yes, we're going to send out notes and resources, slides, materials for everyone. So look out for that. We're going to try and get it out later this week. And yes, a lot of asks for notes. So we'll make sure to do that. I'm going to add the Tenant Talk Live Facebook group. I don't have a Facebook, so I think this is how you click on this and it joins.